We all complain about modern justice being unfair. But imagine if getting accused of theft meant you literally had to eat dry bread and cheese without choking. I'm not kidding. If you gagged, you were guilty. That was actually how they determined innocence in medieval times, using what they called the ordeal of the morsel. And that's not even the worst part. If you were accused of any crime, they'd throw you in a river and wait to see if God would save you or drown you. Medieval justice was basically divine roulette where everyone loses, and the whole system was built on the twisted idea that God would somehow intervene to protect the innocent. I've got some shocking revelations coming up that will completely change how you see medieval history. If this is revealing information you've never heard before, hit that like button to help other people discover this hidden history. Let us start with Law 1. King Henry VIII took royal paranoia to a whole new level when he literally made a law to boil people alive. I'm not talking about some ancient barbaric tradition that got passed down through generations. No, Henry personally created this punishment in 1531 because he was so terrified of being poisoned that he decided anyone who killed someone with poison deserved to be slow cooked like a lobster. The guy was so paranoid about assassination that he invented new ways to torture people to death. The whole thing started with the Poisoning Act of 1531, which made murder by poison an act of high treason. Not regular murder, mind you. High treason. The same category as betraying the king or trying to overthrow the government. Because apparently, poisoning someone was so threatening to Henry that he elevated it to the highest possible crime, and the punishment for high treason wasn't just execution. It was death by boiling. Literally cooking people alive in giant pots of water. This wasn't some random law that Henry thought up during a boring afternoon. This was his direct response to a specific poisoning incident that happened in February 1531. Someone had actually tried to poison people in his kingdom, and Henry lost his mind over it. He was so freaked out by the idea that anyone could slip poison into food that he decided to make the punishment so horrific that nobody would ever dare try it again. The poisoning incident involved a cook named Richard Roos who worked for the Bishop of Rochester. This guy decided to add poison to the porridge that was being served to the bishop's guests, servants, and even the poor people who came to the kitchen looking for charity. I mean, who poisons porridge meant for starving beggars? That's just evil. The poison killed 2 people. Burnett Kerwen, who worked in the bishop's household, and Alice Trippitt, who was just a beggar looking for food. When they arrested Roos, he claimed some stranger had given him the poison and told him it was just a joke. He said he thought it would just make people sick, not kill them. The church and state officials widely believed he was just a pawn in someone else's scheme, but it didn't matter. Henry was so worked up about the whole thing that he was going to make an example out of this cook no matter what. They dragged Roos to the Tower of London and tortured him to get more information. Because apparently, poisoning people wasn't enough of a crime, they had to torture him too. They wanted to know if he was working for someone else, if this was part of some bigger plot against the king. Henry was convinced that poisoners were everywhere, plotting to kill him and his nobles. Here's where it gets really twisted. Parliament retroactively criminalised poisoning as treason through an Act of Attainder, which meant they could execute Roos without a trial. Henry literally changed the law backwards in time just so he could boil this guy alive. That's not justice, that's just revenge with extra steps. He was so obsessed with making an example that he rewrote history to make it legal. The execution happened at Smithfield in London on April 15, 1531. They built a giant fire under a huge pot of water and waited for it to boil. Then they lowered Richard Roos into the pot and cooked him alive. According to the Chronicle of the Grey Friars of London, he roared mighty loud, and women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw and were carried away half dead. So basically, the guy was screaming so loud that pregnant women were fainting. The whole process was designed to be more terrifying than quick execution. A beheading takes maybe 10 seconds. Hanging takes a few minutes. But boiling someone alive, that takes a long time. The water has to heat up gradually. The person has to sit there feeling the temperature rise. They know exactly what's happening and they can't do anything to stop it. It's psychological torture combined with physical torture. The really twisted part is that Henry later used these same treason laws to execute bishops and other religious leaders who disagreed with him. He created this law to punish poisoners, but then he expanded it to cover anyone who opposed his break with the Catholic Church. So his paranoia about poison ended up becoming a tool for religious persecution. The guy turned his fear of assassination into a weapon against his political enemies. The act of boiling alive was incredibly rare in England. Most people got hanged or beheaded. But Henry was so freaked out by poisoning that he decided regular execution wasn't scary enough. He needed something that would really make people think twice before messing with poison. So he brought back one of the most brutal execution methods in human history, just to deal with his personal fears. Think about the message this sent to everyone in the kingdom. The king was so afraid of being poisoned that he'd literally cook people alive for it. Every cook, every servant, every person who handled food was now terrified of accidentally making someone sick. Because if the king thought you poisoned someone, you weren't just going to die, you were going to die slowly and painfully while everyone watched. Modern legal systems would classify this as cruel and inhuman torture. Boiling someone alive violates every principle of humane punishment. It's designed to cause maximum suffering for the longest possible time. Any court today would throw out this punishment as unconstitutional before you could even finish describing it. The method is so brutal that it's considered a war crime. The whole thing shows how one person's paranoia can corrupt an entire justice system. Henry was so scared of poison that he created laws based on fear rather than fairness. He wasn't trying to create a just society, he was trying to protect himself from his own imagination. And thousands of people suffered because their king couldn't handle his anxiety like a normal person. But apparently, medieval rulers had even more creative ways to handle legal disputes. If you thought that was bad, wait to hear about Law 2. Enter the ordeal of the morsel, where your ability to swallow dry food without choking determined whether you went to prison. What if the next time you got accused of something, they just handed you a cracker and watched to see if you could get it down? That's basically what medieval people thought was scientific. They called it trial by ingestion, and it was their idea of a foolproof lie detector test. Because apparently, God would prevent guilty people from swallowing blessed food. Yeah, that makes total sense. The whole system worked like this. You get accused of stealing your neighbor's pig or whatever. Instead of looking for evidence or asking witnesses, they drag you to the local priest who's got some bread and cheese ready to go. Not just any bread and cheese, mind you. This stuff had to be blessed by the church first. The priest would say some prayers over it, sprinkle it with holy water, and then hand it to you with a smile. Good luck swallowing that without choking, because if you do, you're going to jail. The logic was absolutely insane. They figured that if you were innocent, God would help the food go down smooth. But if you were guilty, divine intervention would make you choke on it. So your gag reflex became evidence in a court of law. Think about that for a second. Your body's natural response to dry food in your mouth could literally determine whether you lived or died. That's not justice, that's just watching people eat crackers and calling it science. Picture yourself standing in front of a crowd of angry villagers who think you stole something. The priest hands you this chunk of dry bread and some cheese. Everyone's staring at you, waiting to see if you'll choke. Your mouth is already getting dry from fear. Your heart is pounding, your hands are shaking. And now you're supposed to casually eat this blessed food like you're having a picnic. The pressure alone would make anyone struggle to swallow. The psychological torture was unreal. You're standing there knowing that one wrong swallow could ruin your life. Maybe you've got a naturally sensitive gag reflex. Maybe you're lactose intolerant. Maybe you just don't like cheese. Doesn't matter. If you can't get it down without coughing or gagging, you're guilty. The crowd starts murmuring, the priest nods knowingly, and suddenly you're a convicted criminal because you couldn't handle some dry bread. Fear made it worse. Shaking hands, dry mouth, and no water made choking almost inevitable. The more innocent you were, the more scared you'd be about being wrongly convicted. The more scared you were, the harder it would be to swallow. It was a perfect system for convicting innocent people. The whole thing was designed to look scientific and objective. The priest would carefully prepare the blessed food. He'd say the right prayers. He'd make sure everything was done according to church rules. Then he'd watch you try to eat it like he was conducting some kind of experiment. But there was nothing scientific about it. It was just watching people struggle with dry food and calling it divine judgment. You know what's really crazy? They actually believed this was more reliable than evidence or witnesses. They thought that watching someone gag on cheese was better proof than finding stolen goods in their house. Because humans could lie, but God wouldn't let guilty people swallow blessed food. That was their reasoning. A person's ability to eat crackers without choking was considered more trustworthy than actual facts. Medieval people actually thought this was an improvement over other methods of determining guilt. They looked at trial by ingestion and thought it was more fair than trial by ordeal. At least with the cheese test, you didn't have to drown. You just had to eat some food without choking. How hard could that be? Apparently, Pretty hard when your life depends on it and you're surrounded by people who want to see you fail. The really sick part is how this affected innocent people. Imagine being falsely accused of a crime and then having to prove your innocence by eating dry bread. You know you didn't do anything wrong, but now you're standing there with a mouthful of sawdust trying not to cough. Every little throat-clearing sound makes the crowd lean forward. Every moment of hesitation makes them more suspicious. You're innocent, but your body is betraying you. This method had absolutely zero scientific basis, but medieval people treated it like it was foolproof. They thought they'd figured out the perfect way to separate guilty people from innocent ones. Just watch them eat and see what happens. God would take care of the rest. It was divine judgment in action. Except it wasn't divine, and it wasn't judgment, it was just cruel and stupid. This practice was later absorbed into the Eucharistic ordeal, where a false oath was believed to bring divine punishment within the year, but was phased out by the rise of jury trials in the 13th century. The whole system was eventually abandoned as unreliable, which should tell you something about how bad it was. Think about modern polygraph tests. Those things are controversial and not even admissible in most courts because they're not reliable enough. But at least they measure actual physical responses like heart rate and blood pressure. Medieval people thought watching someone eat cheese was more accurate than a polygraph. That's how backwards their thinking was. Any modern court would laugh this method out of the building. Can you imagine a judge today saying, well, the defendant couldn't swallow this saltine without coughing, so clearly they're guilty? The whole thing would be thrown out as pseudoscience before you could even finish explaining it. It's not evidence, it's just watching people eat food and making up stories about what it means. The cheese test was medieval people's idea of advanced forensic science. They thought they'd cracked the code of human guilt and innocence. All you had to do was hand someone some blessed food and watch their throat. If they struggled, case closed. But apparently even this wasn't brutal enough for medieval justice. They had punishments that made choking on bread look like a slap on the wrist. Just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, let us explore Law 3. You steal a piece of bread because you're starving, and they chop off your hand. Not metaphorically. They literally take an axe and cut your hand off at the wrist. That was medieval justice for you. Steal a loaf of bread to feed your family, lose the hand you need to work and feed your family. The logic was bulletproof. If you can't use your hands, you can't steal anymore. Problem solved, right? Except now you're disabled, can't work, and probably going to starve anyway. But hey, at least you learned your lesson. This was medieval society's idea of proportional punishment. They figured that if you used your hand to steal, then your hand was the problem. So they'd just remove the problem. Simple. Under Swedish law, goods worth 8 pennies could cost you a hand or ears. Goods worth a half mark meant hanging or exile. King Magnus Eriksson's 1279 thievery law laid it out clearly. Steal something worth a half mark and you'd get flogging and lose an ear. The value of what you stole determined exactly which body part you'd lose. A loaf of bread was worth the same as your ability to work for the rest of your life. Think about the math here. You steal something worth maybe a few pennies and they take away your ability to earn money forever. That's not proportional punishment. That's just vindictive cruelty disguised as justice. I mean, if someone today got their hand chopped off for shoplifting a candy bar, we'd all agree that was completely insane. But back then, that was just Tuesday in medieval times. The whole thing was designed to be a public spectacle. They didn't just quietly cut off your hand in some back room. No antibiotics, no proper wound care. Just hope for the best. A lot of people died from infections that started at their amputation site. Even if you survived the infection, you still couldn't work. Try doing manual labor with one hand. Try farming with no fingers. Try being a blacksmith or a carpenter after they cut off your dominant hand. You couldn't support yourself or your family, so you'd end up begging on the streets, probably stealing again just to survive. And then they'd cut off your other hand. It was a perfect system for creating repeat offenders. The economic logic was brutal but simple. They figured that if they made thieves unable to steal again through disability, the problem would solve itself. Can't pick pockets with no fingers. Can't grab bread with no hands. Can't run away with no feet. They were basically creating a permanent criminal class of disfigured people who couldn't work and had to resort to begging or stealing to survive. These mutilated people would form their own communities on the outskirts of towns, groups of one-handed thieves and noseless beggars living together because nobody else would associate with them. They'd have to help each other survive because the rest of society had written them off. The really sick part is how this affected families. Your husband gets his hand chopped off for stealing grain, and now your whole family is screwed. He can't work anymore. You can't support everyone by yourself. Your kids are going to starve. So maybe you start stealing food to keep them alive. Now you get your hand chopped off too. Congratulations, your whole family is now disabled and marked as criminals. That's some real justice right there. Medieval people actually thought this was merciful compared to execution. They'd look at someone getting their hand chopped off and think, well, at least they're still alive. Sure, they're disabled and marked for life and probably going to die from infection or starvation. But technically they're breathing, so that counts as mercy. The bar for compassion was pretty low back then. The whole system was designed to terrorize people into not stealing. The idea was that if you saw your neighbor get his hand chopped off for stealing bread, you'd think twice before taking anything that wasn't yours. Fear was the whole point. They weren't trying to rehabilitate criminals or help them become productive members of society. They were just trying to scare everyone into compliance through brutal public mutilation. In an era without organized police forces, these public displays served as the primary deterrent against crime. But here's the thing about fear-based justice. It doesn't actually work. People kept stealing anyway. Because when you're starving, the threat of losing a hand doesn't seem as scary as watching your kids starve to death. Desperate people do desperate things, no matter how brutal the punishment. So medieval towns were full of one-handed thieves and noseless beggars, and crime rates didn't go down. Modern legal systems would classify these punishments as grievous bodily harm. If someone today chopped off a shoplifter's hand, they'd be charged with assault and battery at minimum, probably aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, maybe even attempted murder depending on the circumstances. The person doing the chopping would get more jail time than the original thief. That's how backwards medieval justice was. Any judge today would look at these punishments and immediately recognize them as cruel and unusual. Cutting off someone's hand for stealing bread violates every principle of proportional punishment. The punishment has to fit the crime. Taking away someone's ability to work for life because they stole food is not proportional. It's just sadistic. But apparently, chopping off hands and noses wasn't creative enough for some medieval rulers. They needed something more dramatic, more terrifying, something that would really make people think twice before crossing them. And some of these rulers got so paranoid about their own safety that they invented punishments that made mutilation look almost reasonable by comparison. It keeps getting worse. This is Law 4. The cold water ordeal was their most popular method, and it was absolutely diabolical. Medieval people thought God would literally save innocent people from drowning. I mean, they had this whole system worked out where if you were accused of a crime, they'd just toss you in the nearest river and see what happened. If you floated, clearly you were guilty, because pure water was rejecting your sinful body. If you sank, well, congratulations on being innocent, but you're probably dead now. It was the ultimate lose-lose situation, where basic physics determined whether you lived or died. This whole thing was called trial by ordeal, and it was basically medieval people's way of letting God handle the tough decisions. The twisted logic went like this. Water was pure and holy, so if you were innocent, wooed, the water would accept you into its embrace. Sure, that meant you'd drown, but at least you'd die with a clean conscience. If you floated, it meant the water was rejecting you because you were guilty of whatever crime they accused you of. Either way, you were screwed. Picture this scene happening in your local town square. A crowd gathers around some poor person who's been accused of stealing grain or sleeping with someone's wife. The local priest shows up with his holy water and starts blessing the river while everyone's getting excited for the show. The accused person is standing there knowing they're about to die no matter what happens. Float and get executed for being guilty, sink and drown for being innocent. What a choice. The worst part is how this method completely ignored every basic human survival instinct. Your body naturally wants to float. Fat floats. Air in your lungs makes you float. Even if you're skinny, holding your breath makes you more buoyant. So essentially, anyone with normal human biology was automatically guilty. The only way to prove innocence was to inhale water and sink like a stone, which meant proving your innocence by dying. Brilliant system. You know what's really messed up? The psychological torture these people went through before they even hit the water. Imagine being dragged to a river by an angry mob knowing that in about 5 minutes you'd either be drowning or getting your head chopped off. You're standing there thinking about whether you should try to float and get executed, or try to sink and drown. Both options suck. There's no winning move. The whole ritual was designed to be terrifying. They didn't just quietly dip you in the water and see what happened. The priest would bless the water with special prayers while the crowd gathered around chanting and yelling. They'd tie your hands behind your back so you couldn't swim, then throw you in while everyone watched to see if God would save you or condemn you. The whole system was so obviously rigged that it's no wonder church authorities eventually stepped in. By 1215, Pope Innocent III had seen enough and forbade priests from blessing ordeals, effectively ending water trials across Europe by the early 16th century. But they kept doing it anyway for centuries because it was easier than actually investigating crimes. You want to know how insane this was? People would sometimes try to game the system by eating rocks or tying weights to their bodies so they'd sink faster. But then the priests would search them for weights and declare that cheating, so you couldn't even try to save yourself without being accused of tampering with God's judgment. The whole thing was set up so that someone was definitely going to die. The really sick part is that this wasn't considered murder back then. This was justice. This was how civilized people determined guilt and innocence. Nobody thought there was anything wrong with drowning innocent people or executing guilty ones based on whether they floated in a river. It was just Tuesday in medieval times. Modern courts would absolutely prosecute this as premeditated murder. You're intentionally putting someone in a situation where they will definitely die, either by drowning or execution. There's no scenario where the accused person walks away alive and free. That's not justice, that's just killing people with extra steps. Any judge today would throw the book at anyone who tried to revive trial by ordeal. Think about it. If someone today grabbed a suspected shoplifter and threw them in a river to see if they'd float, they'd be charged with attempted murder at minimum. If the person drowned, that's manslaughter or murder depending on intent. If they survived and got executed for floating, that's straight up murder. The whole system was basically legalized killing disguised as divine justice. What makes this even more ridiculous is that medieval people actually thought this was an improvement over other methods of determining guilt. They looked at trial by ordeal and thought, finally, an objective way to figure out who's guilty. How very objective. Like throwing people in rivers and seeing if they float is somehow more scientific than actually investigating the crime. The whole thing was designed to terrorize people into confessing before they even got to the river. Most people would rather admit to stealing bread than get thrown in water with their hands tied behind their backs. So the system worked not because it accurately determined guilt, but because it scared people into confessing to crimes they may or may not have committed. But apparently, medieval people thought they had even better solutions for determining guilt, because throwing people in rivers wasn't scientific enough for them. They needed something more sophisticated, more foolproof, something that would really separate the innocent from the guilty based on how their bodies reacted under pressure. If you are still hanging out with us, then you are going to be horrified by Law 5. What if instead of hiring lawyers, you just fought your opponent to the death with swords? I mean, forget about evidence or witnesses or any of that boring stuff. Just grab a weapon and beat the crap out of each other until someone dies. The winner gets to be right, the loser gets to be dead. That was literally how medieval people solved legal disputes. They called it trial by combat, and it was their idea of the ultimate conflict resolution method. This judicially sanctioned duel was rooted in Germanic tribal law and spread across Europe, lasting until the 16th century. The whole system was based on this twisted logic that God would give victory to whoever was telling the truth. So if you were accused of stealing your neighbor's cow, you could challenge them to a sword fight. The winner takes all. The idea was that divine intervention would make sure the righteous person won the battle, because apparently, God cared more about your sword skills than actual facts. If you could swing a blade better than your opponent, you were automatically innocent. Think about how insane this was. Your ability to stab someone to death became proof of your legal position. It didn't matter if you were a terrible person who definitely committed the crime. As long as you were good with a sword, you were golden. Meanwhile, some innocent person who couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag would get murdered in front of everyone, and the crowd would nod and say, well, I guess God has spoken. That's some real divine judgment right there. The whole thing was treated like a religious ceremony. They'd set up special combat arenas with blessed ground and holy symbols everywhere. The priests would come out and bless the weapons before the fight. They'd say prayers over the swords and shields to make sure God was paying attention. The combatants would swear oaths on the Bible before trying to kill each other. It was like a church service, except someone was definitely going to die at the end. According to the Saxenspiegel of 1230, combatants often fought bareheaded and barefoot with light gloves to ensure fairness. So you're fighting to the death, but you can't wear a helmet or shoes. That's medieval logic for you. We want this to be a fair fight so nobody gets to protect their brain from getting split open. Just wear some clothes and hope for the best. The rules were pretty specific about how this whole thing worked. The accuser had to wait for the accused at the designated place of combat. If the accused failed to appear after being summoned 3 times, the accuser could make 2 cuts and 2 stabs against the wind, and the case would be decided in their favor. So you could literally win a legal case by stabbing the air 3 times. That's how seriously they took this whole divine judgment thing. But here's where it gets really unfair. Rich people could hire professional fighters as champions to fight for them. So if some wealthy lord got accused of a crime, he didn't have to risk his own neck. He could just pay some skilled warrior to represent him in combat. Meanwhile, poor people had to fight their own battles. It was basically pay to win justice. The more money you had, the better your chances of surviving your legal problems. This system was rigged from the start. Young, strong men had a huge advantage over everyone else. Women, elderly people, disabled people, anyone who couldn't swing a sword effectively was screwed. Your legal rights depended on your physical strength and fighting ability. If you were too old or too weak to fight, you were basically defenseless in court. That's not justice, that's just bullying with extra steps. The whole thing favored people who were good at violence over people who were good at anything else. You could be the smartest person in the village, but if you couldn't handle a sword, your opinions didn't matter. Some illiterate thug who was good at stabbing people could win legal arguments against scholars and merchants just by being stronger. Intelligence and truth took a backseat to muscle and aggression. They used this system to resolve all kinds of disputes: property arguments, theft accusations, even minor disagreements between neighbours. The earliest recorded case of wager of battle in England was Wulfstan versus Walter in 1077, just 11 years after the Norman conquest. The names suggest a dispute between a Saxon and a Norman. So right from the start, this system was being used to settle ethnic tensions through violence. The Tractatus of Glanville from around 1187 considered trial by combat the primary mode of trial, at least for aristocrats entitled to bear arms. So this wasn't some rare occurrence. This was the main way upper-class people resolved legal disputes. Rich people were literally killing each other in court on a regular basis. That's how they handled business disagreements and property disputes. Just sword fight until someone dies. Around 1219, trial by jury began to replace trial by ordeal, but combat stuck around much longer. With the rise of the legal profession in the 13th century, lawyers steered people away from the wager of battle to protect their clients. Because even medieval lawyers realized that having your client fight to the death was bad for business. Dead clients don't pay legal fees. Today, courts prefer evidence over edger. Imagine suing your neighbors through mixed martial arts cage matches instead of small claims court. That's basically what medieval people thought was a reasonable way to handle civil disputes. The whole system was designed to terrorize people into avoiding legal conflicts altogether. Most people would rather just accept being wronged than risk getting killed in combat. Modern courts would classify this as legalized murder. You're literally setting up a situation where someone is guaranteed to die over a legal dispute. That's not conflict resolution, that's just state-sanctioned killing. Any judge today would throw out this method as completely insane. The person who won the fight would probably get charged with murder themselves. But apparently, medieval people had even more disturbing ideas about what constituted acceptable legal practices. Because settling disputes with swords wasn't the only area where they completely abandoned basic human decency. Okay, now things are going to take a very disturbing turn. This is Law 6. Medieval law had some truly disturbing ideas about what constituted acceptable social practices. In medieval Europe, canonical law set marriageable age at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, mainly for political dowries. Not 16, not 18, not even 14 for girls, 12 years old. That's 6th grade. These were kids who still played with dolls and couldn't even read, but medieval society thought they were ready for marriage and everything that came with it. Boys had to wait until they were 14, which was apparently the magic age when they could handle the responsibility of owning a wife. Because that's basically what it was. Owning another person. This wasn't some rare exception or emergency situation. This was standard legal practice across medieval Europe, particularly among the aristocracy where marriages served as strategic alliances. The church officially set these ages, and everyone just went along with it like it was perfectly normal. 12-year-old girls were getting married to grown men, and nobody thought there was anything wrong with that picture. I mean, these kids were barely out of childhood, but medieval people looked at them and thought, yep, ready for marriage and babies. That's some seriously messed up thinking right there. The whole system was designed to treat young girls as property in marriage contracts. Families would negotiate these deals like they were trading livestock. The girl's father would sit down with the boy's father and hammer out the details: how much money would change hands, what property would be included, what political connections would be made. The actual girl involved had zero say in any of it. She was just the commodity being traded between two families who wanted to make a deal. Aristocratic families used these marriages as business deals to build social connections and secure property. Your 12-year-old daughter wasn't your child anymore, she was a political asset. You could marry her off to the right family and suddenly you're connected to powerful people. Maybe you get access to their land, maybe you get protection from their army, maybe you get a better position at court. The girl was just the price you paid to get what you wanted. Dowries served as contractual inheritance gifts binding families, emphasizing marriage as a strategic alliance. When you had a daughter, you weren't raising a child. You were raising a product that you could eventually sell to another family. You'd spend years accumulating money and property to give away when she got married. The more dowry you could offer, the better husband you could buy for her. It was like a medieval auction where young girls were the merchandise. Picture this whole process happening in your neighborhood. Some rich family down the street has a 12-year-old daughter, another rich family has a 25-year-old son. They meet up and decide that their kids should get married. The little girl has no idea what's happening. She's still playing with toys and learning basic skills like reading and cooking. But suddenly she's engaged to an adult man who's old enough to be her teacher or her babysitter. The bride's family would publicly present the dowry at the wedding ceremony to emphasize the contractual nature of the union. This wasn't about love or compatibility. This was about money changing hands. The whole wedding was basically a business transaction disguised as a celebration. The bride's father would hand over gold, property, and goods to the groom's family while everyone watched. It was like a medieval version of a corporate merger, except the main asset being transferred was a child. Consummation was expected shortly after puberty, regardless of emotional readiness. Nobody cared if the girl was scared, confused, or completely unprepared for what was about to happen. As soon as her body started developing, she was considered ready for adult responsibilities. The fact that she was still mentally and emotionally a child didn't matter. Physical development was the only thing that counted. If she could theoretically have babies, she was ready to be someone's wife. The really sick part is that these marriages were often arranged years before they actually happened. Parents would promise their 8-year-old daughters to other families and sign contracts about future marriages. So you'd have little kids walking around knowing they were already engaged to adults they'd never met. They'd spend their entire childhood knowing that their freedom had an expiration date. That's some serious psychological damage right there. Medieval people actually thought this system was better than letting people choose their own partners. They believed that parents knew what was best for their children and that young people were too stupid to make good decisions about marriage. So they'd take away all choice from kids and force them into relationships with complete strangers, because apparently 12-year-olds couldn't be trusted to pick their own husbands, but they were mature enough to have sex and raise babies. So you could have situations where 12-year-old girls were getting married without their parents even knowing about it. Some adult man could just grab a kid off the street, find a priest, and force her into marriage. The legal system would back him up because technically she was old enough to consent, even though she was obviously too young to understand what was happening to her. The contrast with the modern age of consent laws is absolutely stark. Today we recognize that children can't consent to sexual relationships with adults. We have laws specifically designed to protect kids from predators who want to take advantage of them. We understand that there's a huge difference between physical development and emotional readiness. Medieval people had none of these protections. They just threw kids to the wolves and called it marriage. Modern courts would prosecute these child marriages as sexual abuse in most countries today. Any adult who married a 12-year-old would be arrested, charged, and probably sent to prison for decades. The parents who arranged it would be charged with child endangerment. The priest who performed the ceremony would lose his license. The whole system would be dismantled and everyone involved would be treated as criminals. That's how far we've come from medieval thinking. But apparently, medieval people didn't just ignore children's rights when it came to marriage. They also had some pretty twisted ideas about what constituted appropriate punishment for adults who stepped out of line. Okay, you've made it this far. Let us visit one disgusting but legal practice from medieval times. This is Law 7. The stocks were medieval society's version of turning punishment into public entertainment. You know what medieval people thought was justice? Locking you in wooden stocks so strangers could throw trash at you. I mean, imagine getting arrested for being drunk in public, and instead of getting a fine or spending a night in jail, they drag you to the town square and lock your head and hands in a wooden frame. Then they basically tell everyone in town to come and pelt you with garbage for a few hours. That was their idea of proportional punishment. You got a little too drunk at the tavern. Well, now you're going to sit there while your neighbors throw rotten eggs at your face. This was medieval society's favorite form of entertainment punishment. They called it public shaming, but it was really just organized bullying with the government's approval. The whole system was designed to turn your punishment into everyone else's fun. Got caught stealing bread? Time to become the town's personal punching bag. Cursed at your neighbor? Hope you like having moldy vegetables thrown at your head. The punishment wasn't just about making you suffer, it was about giving everyone else a good time while you suffered. The really sick part is how community members were actually encouraged to abuse helpless prisoners. This wasn't some unfortunate side effect of the punishment. This was the whole point. The local authorities would announce when someone was going to be put in the stocks, and people would mark their calendars. Families would plan their day around it. Kids would save up their allowance to buy rotten fruit to throw. It was like medieval people turned prisoner abuse into a community event. The town square would fill up with people looking for entertainment when someone was getting put in the stocks. Street vendors would set up nearby selling food and drinks. The whole atmosphere resembled a carnival, with community members encouraged to participate in the abuse. It was like a medieval festival, except the main attraction was watching someone get tortured. The stocks were designed to maximize both the humiliation and the physical discomfort. You couldn't move your head or hands. You couldn't protect yourself from anything being thrown at you. You couldn't wipe your face or cover your eyes. You just had to sit there and take whatever the crowd decided to dish out. The wooden frame was built to keep you in the most uncomfortable position possible. Your neck would get sore from being bent forward, your hands would go numb from being held in place, your back would ache from being unable to sit up straight. The whole thing was designed to break people psychologically. Being locked in the stocks wasn't just about physical pain. It was about destroying your dignity and social standing. Everyone in town would see you getting humiliated, your neighbors, your friends, your family, people you'd have to face every day for the rest of your life. The memory of seeing you covered in garbage and getting abused by a mob would never go away. You'd be marked as someone who got put in the stocks, and that reputation would follow you forever. This mob justice often escalated way beyond the original crime. Maybe you got caught selling watered-down beer at your tavern. That's a minor offense that maybe deserved a small fine. But once you're in the stocks, the crowd doesn't care about proportional punishment. They just want to have fun at your expense. So you end up getting beaten half to death by an angry mob because you tried to make a few extra coins by diluting your beer. The punishment becomes way worse than the crime ever was. The crowd would feed off each other's energy and get more violent as time went on. It would start with a few people throwing soft fruit, but then someone would throw something harder, then someone else would throw something even harder. Before you know it, the whole crowd is in a frenzy, throwing garbage and screaming at the person in the stocks. What started as public shaming turned into attempted assault, and nobody tried to stop it because everyone was having too much fun. The psychological damage from this punishment could last for years. Even after your time in the stocks was over, you'd have to live with the memory of being helpless while your neighbors abused you. You'd see the same people who threw garbage at you every day in the market, at church, at community events. You'd never be able to forget that these people enjoyed watching you suffer. That kind of trauma doesn't just go away. It changes how you see the world and how you relate to other people. Stocks remained in use until the 17th century, eventually outlawed as inhuman by evolving legal standards. Modern legal systems would classify this degrading punishment as psychological abuse and public endangerment. Any government official who locked someone in stocks today would be charged with false imprisonment. Anyone who threw objects at the prisoner would be charged with assault. The whole system would be shut down as a violation of basic human rights. But the stocks were just one symptom of a much deeper problem with how medieval justice actually worked. The whole system was built on assumptions that would seem completely backwards to us today. Medieval justice was a nightmare of drowning, dismemberment, and divine judgment that makes our worst legal complaints look trivial. From ordeals and mutilation to evidence and due process, justice has come a long way. Remember, today you get a lawyer, not an axe. You get a presumption of innocence instead of presumption of guilt. You get proportional punishment instead of losing body parts for stealing bread. If you enjoyed uncovering how justice once meant drowning or dismemberment, like and subscribe for more wild history stories.